should we view biblical archaeology? Should we see it as providing proofs, or should we see it as maybe being some sort of illumination, shedding light on something?
I would frame it slightly differently,
Okay.
but I would also say both.
Okay.
And how I typically talk about this in my classes, or if I'm giving a presentation somewhere and I'm doing an introduction or overview of biblical archaeology, is I usually say, I think there are two primary applications of archaeology to the Bible. One is, as you said, illumination, or better understanding the historical context of the scriptures, because, of course, the Bible was written in a land far away and a time long ago, a totally different culture, and over a period of 1,400, 1,500 years. But of course, the events were even more distant than that. And so we can't project our 21st century ideas on them, whatever country that we're in the world today. It's just not going to work. So that helps. And there are some very clear examples of times when archaeological discoveries have helped us understand the text better. One that I really enjoy is, there's a passage in the book of Samuel that is talking about sharpening these different agricultural tools. And if you look in all the translations before the early 20th century, you see that they don't match for this one particular word because they're guessing. And then at the site of Gezer, they excavated this stone weight that had the Hebrew word on it, pim, and they found out that it was 2/3 of a shekel, but it was a weight that had gone out of use early in the monarchy period, and so it was forgotten. Even the Septuagint translators didn't know what it was. So when that was found, then they could correct the translation. And of course, this wasn't anything theologically significant, but still, it helps to illuminate something very specific.
Absolutely.
The second,
go ahead,
as you were saying, you use the word proof. I wouldn't necessarily use the word proof, but I suppose you could talk about it that way in very isolated incidents, in terms of prove that this person existed, or this city did, or this specific event perhaps. But I would frame it more as corroborating the historical reliability of the Bible. So we have the testimony of the Bible itself, and then we also would have, say, the testimony of some other ancient manuscripts, literature. Then we have archaeology, and the archaeology often is confirming what is already recorded there in the Bible. So we might not say archaeology proves the Bible, but we could say that it corroborates or supports the historical reliability of the Bible. And it really is very useful in apologetics.
Yes.
In fact, I think, of course I'm biased, but that it's probably the most useful tool in apologetics, because it's looking at the whole Bible.
Sure.
Whereas if you say another important aspect, of course, is science, but science is typically only addressing those first few chapters of Genesis. And then prophecy, another really important aspect, but that's covering very specific passages as well. So biblical archaeology gets left out of the discussion a lot, and yet it's crucial to apologetics.
Sure. I'm not trying to do an unashamed, plug-in for all of your books that you have written, but I know you did one as Unearthing the Bible.
Yes.
And then it's like 101 archaeological finds that help bring the Bible to life. Now, for me personally, that's how I've always seen archaeology, biblical archaeology, is being able to bring to life the words on the page in a way that we don't have a time machine, to go back into these time periods, into these cultures and societies, to see these things that are found, artifacts that are found, or even locations that are found, and see them in that original context, in their original form. But archaeology gives us a glimpse as to what it would have been like, what it could look like, etc. And you use the example of the weight system, like something that was lost and information, but was able to be regained. And you already stepped into the whole apologetics. I tend to refer to it as the long lost friend of apologetics, because it is respectfully undervalued at times in certain communities, when in actuality it really can bring such a validity and help restore people's faith in the reliability of Scripture. And so in that context, when we talk about culture, who it seems, especially in the West, tends to be very anti-religion at times, or perhaps even just thinks faith is blind, how do we use archaeology in a practical way to be an apologetic, to be a defense of our faith?
So one of the major assaults against the Bible is that it is not a historically accurate text or collection of books, but that it is myths and some legends, some fairy tales, some exaggerated accounts. And archaeology can address that criticism directly by demonstrating through hard physical evidence that these are real places, real people, real events, and in some cases we even have evidence for the events occurring just as they're written about in the Bible and at those exact times that the Bible gives us in its internal chronology. So I think it's incredibly important to have at least some knowledge of those discoveries and how they apply to the Bible if you're going to go in and talk apologetics. Now, because Western culture, and I use that in more in the secular West, of course, not the original meaning of it.
Yes.
Because it has become so atheistic or agnostic and often anti-Christian and anti-biblical, many times we have to go back to questions before the historical reliability even though, and talk about, does God even exist? So people may have to get into that type of issue first, but then they're going to be wondering about the historical reliability and things like, did Jesus even exist? Did he do any of those things that are talked about in the Gospels? Were those places even there in the first century? And that, like you were saying, we've got many, many answers because of 200 years of archaeological work now.
Sure. Well, and I did want to circle back to your book, which I believe is having to do with the historical Jesus and life around the time of Jesus, because of the assaults that people make, claiming that it's myth, claiming that it's legend. And so when we look at this resource, for instance, or maybe even other sources that are going to be similar in topic, what sort of things could we find in there that would help bring a certain level of confidence that Jesus is not just a historical figure, but some of the events and things that took place during his time are valid as well?
I think one of the best places to start is just to look at the historical accounts from writers in the 1st and 2nd centuries who mention Jesus and who mention specific events in his life. There are 11 different texts that talk about Jesus or Christ, some of them use his title, from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, that not only mention his name, but in other cases they give some specific recounting of events. Things like the birth of Jesus are talked about, that he was born in a certain Judean village, and there's knowledge of the virgin birth. It's by this man named Celsus, who is a critic of Christianity, a Roman polytheist, but he knows about these things. And then we have in passages like Tacitus and Josephus, where they talk about the trial of Jesus, and Pontius Pilate and Tiberius is the emperor, and that Jesus was crucified. And then Josephus even mentions reports of the resurrection, not that he believes it, but he mentions that it's reported. We read about the disciples continuing on after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension. And we read about things like he was a teacher and he performed miracles and was a man of high moral standing. So we could take those extra biblical sources from the 1st and 2nd century and reassemble a very brief look at Jesus, even without the New Testament.
Sure.
So when people say, there's no historical evidence for Jesus from ancient times, completely false. We know a good amount about him from outside the Bible, and now we even have, I think, 2 inscriptions that refer to Jesus from the 1st century, one that uses his name Jesus and one that uses his title Christ. And those are incredibly important because they're not manuscript copies, they're archaeological inscriptions from the 1st century.
Sure. Yeah, well, and that was kind of segueing into my question about how do we deal with maybe skeptics or people who are skeptical of the myth or the legend of the New Testament. And so it seems, based on what you're saying, that one of the best places to start would be to look at some of the ancient documents, the extra biblical sources, things that maybe aren't even in the Bible. Of course, use the Bible and use the New Testament and what it says, but there's secular evidence that we can take into account for the historicity of Jesus and the life that he lived. Now, I'm sure that we usually have a good bit of TKA family, parents joining in with us, and they might be thinking to themselves, okay, a lot of this sounds good and practical and something that, would be good to learn a bit more about, do some research, etc. But what if they have some of their children coming up to them and saying, hey, I heard that the New Testament is not reliable. I heard the Bible is not all that reliable. It was written by men, or whatever sort of skeptical conversation people tend to have. But they're looking for something practical to share with their kids. Is there things that they could point them to, direct them to, like YouTube videos or resources online, or or maybe even some books, things that would be really helpful for parents in the home as they're discipling their kids, as they're raising them, hopefully in godliness, to point them to some of the things that could be helpful for them to understand a little bit more about this topic?
Yeah, there are tons of resources available, especially about Jesus in the Gospels, from articles to books to short videos to longer series, documentary style. So I think it depends more on the age of the student and what medium they're going to spend more time looking at or looking into, whether they like to read or they would prefer to watch a video because maybe they're not going to spend the time reading a book or an article, but they might watch a documentary or a video about it, or even an interview on YouTube. So there's lots of things that they can direct them to, but of course, parents can also read and watch these things themselves and then go through that material with their kids and help them to understand it. I think high school kids, especially when you're getting to the latter end of high school, they're going to be able to grasp almost all of it if they put their mind to it. But if you have, say, a sixth grader, they're probably going to need parents to help explain some of the things to them.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I have 2 little kids, one in 4th grade, one in 1st grade, and by God's grace, they're very interested in the Bible, Jesus. And so my wife and I, we've been trying to go through different materials here and there to expose them a little bit at a time, and be a little thought-provoking questions. So it's always helpful to know some additional resources and things that we could take a look at. One of the questions I did want to ask you was, has there been anything, whether it's something that you led personally, a project you led personally, or just something from history that has deepened your faith, an archaeological find or discovery that has deepened your faith?
I would say the first thing really was when I visited the lands of the Bible. The first time I went, places like Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which of course apply to both Old and New Testaments, and then a variety of other sites at Jericho and Hatzor and Gezer and Lachish. All these different places eventually made it to Egypt and Greece. But that really deepened my faith in that I was reading the pages of the Bible and it was more real to me because I had been there and I had seen those things, and it transitioned a bit from being only a book of theology and spiritual information to this happened in physical space and physical reality. It was here, and as I read it, I can visualize that a little bit better. So for me, that was huge. It opened up a new perspective on reading the Bible.
Yeah.
I don't think it informed me theologically any better, but it just gave me a more real connection with those events and the people. But as far as an archaeological discovery that impacted my faith more, there have been quite a few, I think, but some of my favorites have been excavating or doing a survey actually in the hill country near the site of Ai, and we found a new unexcavated, unidentified archaeological site that we thought was a candidate for one of the lesser known sites in the Bible. It's mentioned in Joshua 7:2 called Beit Aven. And we started excavating there, and we found a Canaanite altar from the time of basically Moses and Joshua, and then it was abandoned probably as a result of the conquest and settlement. So that was just an incredible experience, being able to dig something that had not been discovered before, to identify something biblically, and to be involved in this is what some of the people talked about in the Bible were doing, and then its abandonment was a result of one of the main narratives of the Bible.
No, that's great. And that's one of the things, I've never been on an archaeological dig or been a part of something to that extent, but one of the things I always appreciated about, I had an Old Testament backgrounds course when I was a student, and it just helped make so much more sense of the culture, the time period, and I imagine from a hands-on, a tangible way, archaeology works in a very similar fashion, and maybe one of these days I'll find myself over there just as an observer, but I do hope to at some point. Well, the last question I wanted to ask you, because I want to give you some time to be able to do what you need to do throughout the day, but if you could discover anything that has, an artifact that's gone missing, whether it's from the Bible, maybe a location, if you could be the one to do that, what would be the thing that pops in your head first? Like, if we could just find this, or if I could find this, that would be amazing.
Oh,
I know. There's probably so many.
There'd be a few, yeah. But, a couple of them come to mind, probably. So some of the most disputed periods in academic circles of biblical history are things like Exodus, Joshua, or the patriarchs. So for me, I think really important discoveries would be something related to those periods. If we're talking about the time of Joshua, a copy of the law that they read, or a fragment of that it's talked about in the book of Joshua. So they had some of these physical copies back then, but we don't have any and haven't discovered any. That would be incredibly important. Not only would it be historical corroboration of some of those passages, but it would also then be a manuscript, essentially, of a section of the Bible.
For sure.
Centuries earlier, 1,000 years earlier, even than the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it would impact both textual studies and historical archaeological. That, to me, would be very, very incredible. Written material, inscriptions is always highly prized in archaeology because there's less interpretation involved in it. It's very straightforward, and it's hard to dispute that, and so it's clear evidence.
Absolutely. No, that sounds great. And like I said, there's so many things that people, fancifully think about archaeology, and if they could find this or if we could find that. But it has been really neat, at least from the outside looking in, as an observer, to see. I feel like each year there's something, incredible or fascinating happening within biblical archaeology, things that are being found, talked about, and being able to shed light on what Scripture has said. Well, I just want to thank you so much for your time. It's been great having this conversation with you.
Hey, thank you.
I enjoy it, and I hope all of you have a good rest of your day.